You can start the recording. Okay,
Yes.
thanks. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I am Valentina Delciotti, the editorial director of Diversity, the magazine that today has the honor and the pleasure of presenting a preview for Italy of the Rohini Anand's new book. I have it. So, Leading Global Diversity, Equity and Inclusion. You must read it. And Rohini is a published author, and she featured in Boston Globe, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and so many others. Kristen Anderson will moderate the conversation. Hi, Kristen, and welcome Rohini. Kristen, you have all already met her on our screens too. And she is internationally recognized DE&I Inspirational Leader 2021 and Vice Chair at the European Women on Board. Then two highly esteemed leaders and Diversity's friends, Mara Zavagno and Nadia Bertaggia, will enrich this dialogue. So I am more than sure that this conversation about to begin will be rich and interesting and inspiring, because our guests are interesting and inspiring. So I don't steal time anymore. I remind the public to turn off the cameras and microphones, please, and to communicate with us through the written chat. And that's all, and thank you.
Well, thank you, Valentina, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the invitation to moderate this panel. I think it's going to be a lot of fun, very interesting over the next hour. You already introduced our esteemed panelists, but I just want to say a bit of their titles. Rohini Anand is the Strategic DE&I Advisor and author of the book you mentioned, and also was the Chief DE&I Officer for over 20 years for Sodexo. Mara Zavagno is Chief D&I Officer currently for Konecranes, and Nadia Bertaggia is the HR VP of Southern Europe area for Sodexo. So welcome all three of you to this panel. I know all three of you because previous to joining European Women on Boards, I was the Chief DEI Officer for Barilla. So we have a DEI officer network going here today. I first have to say one word for the audience. If you don't know European Women on Boards, it's a nonprofit that works to elevate women into more senior decision-making roles. So look online and find out more about European Women on Boards. But with no further ado, I think we should start our panel. And as Valentina said, please put any questions or comments in the chat, and we will make sure to have time to answer those during our panel and at the end as well. So let's start off with the first question. Rohini, everyone here today has a DEI story. So could you please share with us what brought you to the DEI work that you do now and the book?
Wonderful. Thank you, Kristen, and good afternoon to everyone. Good morning, good evening. I'm very delighted to be here today with Kristen, my friend, and of course, Nadia from Sodexo, and Mara as well. Wonderful to meet you. So happy to be here. And you're right, Kristen. You know, everyone that's involved in DEI work, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, it's very personal for them. It's not something that's just a job. It's, you know, it means a lot. And so my story is very integral to who I am. I grew up in Mumbai, India, and I grew up where everyone pretty much looked like me with the same skin tones. I belonged to the majority religion, Hinduism, and surrounded by others like me, I had the privilege of not having to think about my identity. So I moved to the US as a single young Indian woman, and that was the inflection point in my journey, both literally and metaphorically. And my identity shifted from being a person who saw herself at the center of her world to being a minority, to being an immigrant, and to being a foreigner. And honestly, I was totally unprepared for that. And it was only when I was identified as a minority did I realize the privileges that came with being part of a majority. I was part of the majority growing up in India, and I hadn't really recognized my privilege in that way. And honestly, I was unable to until I was perceived as a minority and I experienced things differently. So this realization that, identity is very situational, it's fluid, has informed all the work that I do and still continues to inform my work. And this vocation is very personal for me. I say that my vocation and my avocation are perfectly aligned. Understanding what it means to be perceived as a minority, as an outsider, is very much at the heart of DEI work. And my role is to level the playing field so everyone can succeed. So that's my story, Kristen.
Yes, your story, Rohini, is very much about empathy too, right? If you can't feel what it's like to be in someone else's place, you won't have the empathy for their situation.
Absolutely right, Kristen.
Rohini, I want to ask you another question, which probably the audience is very interested to hear. That why did you decide to write this book, and why now?
Yeah, it's a good question again. So, when I rewired from Sodexo in January of 2020, COVID hit. So I decided to hunker down and to write about my lived experience. This was my opportunity to give back what I had acquired from this work to those who do, like all of you on this call, who do the very difficult work of DEI change. So for me, this book is an act of reflection. It's an act of closure. It's an act of giving back. And to be honest, I was prompted by the painfully slow progress in DEI. CEOs have made these very performative, lofty statements. In the US alone, CEOs have given over $200 billion for racial equity causes, which is, a good start. But I think the moment is now to be ambitious. And with the murder of George Floyd, the Black man in the United States, going viral, there is an opportunity to do more. So the question in my head was, how do we go from these sort of isolated situational actions to really sustainable progress, especially globally? And when I was doing this work, Kristen, I yearned for a practical book, something that when I give talks, DEI, global DEI, it piques the most interest, but really causes the most frustration. So this is not an academic or theoretical book. It's honestly a view from the trenches of someone who's had to do the work and pioneer a way forward without any real map. So it's a very practical book that I wanted to give to the audience who do the difficult work.
Day-to-day work. Did the book evolve or change from when you started until the end product that was just recently published? And how did it change, if so?
Yeah, so this is, I think this is my first book, right? Probably my last, but it did change. When I started the book, it was more about a how-to. And what I realized was that it was more important for the audience to learn about the informative story behind the story. So I'm very honest, very transparent about my own journey on DEI. This is not something that everyone is born with. There's some areas where we have more empathy, as you said, Kristen, but other areas where we are a work in progress. So it chronicles my own journey, but then it also chronicles the missteps and the lessons that I have learned. Because honestly, it's the challenges that brought me the greatest inspiration and insights, and ultimately the most lasting change. And so just very quickly, the one story that I share is a story in India. I went back to do DEI work to India, and I'm sitting in this room full of entry to middle management women talking about career advancement. And I talked to them about, leadership development, mentoring, and I'm met with these blank stares. And then I stepped back and I asked them, I said, what can the company do to help you to advance your careers? And one woman gingerly raised her hand and she said, we live in these multi-generational joint families with our in-laws. And if we stay late to work on a project, we still have to go home and do the housework, and our in-laws, our mother-in-law gets upset. And it was just such an aha moment for me because I had forgotten the multi-generational joint family dynamic in India. I'd forgotten the role of the Indian woman as a mother, as a wife, but also as a daughter-in-law. And to be honest, I'd forgotten my own limitations as a sort of multi-dimensional being. And I was so focused on this one aspect of my shared identity with these women, and I'd overlooked the differences. So it's these kinds of missteps that gave me and taught me the earliest lessons, honestly, that it's not useful to export what's worked in one part of the world to another part of the world, and that I really need to check my presumptions. So, this work is about disrupting our own worldviews in order to bring about transformation in others. So, yeah, the book did evolve. It did evolve for sure.
Well, that leads us into, Rohini, your 5 principles. Could you briefly go through the 5, and then we'll go into each one in more depth, and I'll ask some questions of Nadia and Mara as well.
I'm not going to explain them, Kristen, but the 5 are: make it local is the first one. The second is what I call leaders change to lead change. The third is, and it's good business too. The fourth is go deep, wide, and inside out. And the fifth is know what matters and count it. So those are the 5 principles.
Great. And so we're going to go into each one and give some specific examples of what people can do that are listening on the call, because I'm sure they want to know those practical pieces of advice that you cover in your book. Again, if people just joined, this is the book, Leading Global Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. So let's go to the first principle. First principle, as you already mentioned, is make it local. Now, this really resonated for me, and I know you included this example in your book, which when I was working in Barilla. I will explain a little bit about what could be example from Barilla, but I would like to recognize that the current Chief Diversity Officer and Inclusion Officer, Talita Erickson for Barilla, is here. So if she has even more experience, and she was the first Chief Diversity Officer as well. So she's really the one that's been driving this agenda. So thank you for joining, Talita. But just to make it local, one of the things I think that the DE&I team in Barilla did a very good job in is to localize ERGs. To not only have for those of you who don't know, ERG stands for Employee Resource Group or Affinity Group. It's a way for people of that group and also allies to help make the environment more inclusive for that element of diversity. Sometimes you may have an office or a factory that doesn't have a lot of employees, but they want to focus on including others that are different. And so in Barilla, there's a governance toolkit on how to form an ERG. And ERGs can be formed around one affinity, for example, LGBT inclusion or inclusion of women and men, work-life balance, or people with disabilities. But then also in smaller offices or factories, the ERG can be about a changing element of diversity. So in Russia, they formed an ERG called Bridge, and it was about leadership styles and diverse leadership styles. And then the next year they could change it to another element, so you can get a population much more extensive to get involved. And that can, again, we know that engagement of employees everywhere is an important element of culture change. So you can read more about that in your book, Rohini. But let's go first to other examples. Mara, can you share an example of how you have localized any element of your global DEI strategy? Thanks for joining us, Mara.
Thank you to you for having me here. Well, I would like to take the example of our DE&I vision. Because I think that this is actually is embedding the local side within the concept itself. And when actually COVID started, we decided to accelerate our journey related to diversity, equity, inclusion. And what we did was to create or to review our vision, and doing so by leveraging our local communities around the world. So we made a global workshop. We invited all different local people from the different regions, and we embedded their contribution in our DE&I vision. And what we expect, actually, what is proclaiming our vision, is that we want to represent the multicultural communities where we operate. Now, this is a quite powerful, I needed to say, statement, because what we aim really to do is to cooperate with each country, with each local community, and making sure that together with them we generate the targets that are important for their country. And we look to is a topic that is encompassing all the aspects of diversity and equity and inclusion that the local communities feel important for them. What they do is to benchmark their local demographic. And what we expect from them actually is that they are at least able to represent these within their organizations. So if we take one simple example, if we speak about demographic aspect and we take a country like China, speaking about nationalities won't resonate for them. But speaking about how to really be inclusive, for example, for even regional diversity, because it's what we talk about, or even a rural population that should be integrated, is very much part of their culture. But if we're approaching these like we did more in European countries, then you look for more, if you want, typical or traditional statistics. And with these, I will say, involvement and outreach that we work to localize actually our DE&I activities. On top of that, we have been creating regional champions who are facilitating these dialogues per each region, and they are helping to connect the global statements and the ground with the local culture. So that is what we do on a daily basis, and is a very strong and important embedded target for us in Konecranes currently.
No, thank you, Mara. I think there's some key themes in your example and what I talked about that the Barilla team had done, which is really to be able to draw people in on the local topic that is really engaging for them, and then to have someone that is a champion or a member that takes the global topics to the local context. So thank you for those examples, some key themes. Now I'd like to pass the virtual microphone over to Nadia from Sodexo. Nadia, you have some examples to share as well. So welcome, Nadia.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you for inviting me here. And I'm really, first of all, let me say I'm honored to be here and to see through a virtual screen Rohini, because she's my star. I learned everything from her. She really believes in what she did and she's doing, and I learned really a lot from scratch, because make it local is fundamental. When you start in a country like Italy, for example, Mara, probably you are in a different country, but Italy, it was really hard. And I really started from scratch because the culture was a bit rusty, and we had to scrap a little bit before starting any action. And therefore, I truly believe it is fundamental to make it local, to consider the context, the country, the culture, the company culture within your country, and the state of readiness of your leaders and of your employees is fundamental. So out of the 5 dimensions that we highlighted, gender, disabilities, cultures and origins, generations, and sexual orientation, I had to choose to make it local and to break through. I had to choose the 2 dimensions that I thought were closer and could better be accepted by our management to start with. So our first actions were directed towards cultures and origins and disabilities, because our senior people and our management was more sensitive to these 2 dimensions. So we started by creating education themes within our in food for disabled people within our school strand market sector, and that was very successful. And we also started with cultures and origins that, by our very nature, we already have a lot of different nationalities within our people, within our employees. If you consider that we are present in 56 countries with more than 420,000 employees in the world, you can imagine that we already have a strong, let me say, mix of culture. But within Italy, we have 86 nationalities as well, with 11,500 people, let's say, in Italy. So by nature, we are close to these mixings of culture, and we started favoring and accompanying the trend of refugees, and that worked very, very well. So if I had started in Italy, and Ruini knows that very well, from other dimensions, I wouldn't have had a chance. By starting with these two dimensions that locally within our reality made more sense, I managed to start a good path, and that was very, very successful. And you know, I'm very proud of what I learned, because again, that was very important. And as the message from Ruini came very, very clearly, sometimes it is fundamental that this change that you want to bring comes from within. It's important that you have to go through some sort of, let me say, discrimination to understand how strongly you can feel about this and convince the others.
Great example, Nadia. Thank you. And I'll write in the chat about, many of you know about 10 Partnership. It was a great nonprofit organization to integrate refugees, because you mentioned that, Nadia, in the context of Italy. So thank you for your examples. I'm going to pass back to Ruini. Ruini, what did you find most challenging when you're talking about examples of localizing global DEI work?
Yeah, I think, first of all, Mara and Nadia, those were fantastic examples. I think you both sort of really hit it, you know, captured the essence, because it really is about making sure that whatever you're doing globally gets translated locally, and using local change agents to bring about that change. So it's not about necessarily accepting the status quo, but finding the right entry points, pacing it to the readiness of the country and of the organization, and then pushing for change. So your question again, Kristen, was what I found most challenging, is that right? Yeah, so, you know, I mean, the one area, and Nadia mentioned this, and so did you, about refugees, right? So my one sort of challenge was, and honestly, a bit of a regret, was that I did not address race and ethnicity, but race in particular, substantively. And I honestly found this the most difficult dimension to address. You know, Nadia talked about the readiness and where, you know, how the entry point. So it's extremely sensitive, it's politically charged, and race is often talked about in code or not at all. So in Europe, the example that you gave, Kristen, as well as Nadia, the refugee employment, providing jobs and expanding empathy at work, is a great entry point in the discussion on race, because frequently refugees are the visibly non-dominant group, right? Very often they're non-dominant religion or non-dominant ethnicity. So it's a good way to enter the conversation. And I'm very proud of the work that we did in partnership with Tend Partnership. But, you know, I wish I could have made more progress in this work in different parts of the world. And I know that I'm not alone, because a lot of my counterparts also felt very stymied about addressing issues of race bias. There are very, very few best practice examples, as I found even in doing research for the book. And it's challenging, Kristen, because race and racism are both very universal. You know, the experiences are universal, but it's highly specific. It's very local. And every context has its own dominant and non-dominant groups, and these differ. So, you know, Mara talked about rural population, you know, as an example, or race, or sorry, religion or caste. And you know, the other thing is that race and racism are very fluid, and it's honestly shaped by the history and the culture of a place. So you can't use a standard cookie cutter approach to dismantle it. And oftentimes it's tangled up with other things like ethnicity or religion or caste, which makes, you know, which may take more predominance or more prominence than race does. So in the US, the driving force, social force, is race. And, you know, elsewhere, race may be just one of many identities that divide and may play a less prominent role. So if you expect it to be expressed in a manner in which we are familiar, we're going to miss the other important entry points, like discrimination based on the lowest caste or religion in India, or the ethnic undertones in Kenya, you know, those kinds of things. And to complicate things, it's very politically charged, right? So I work for a French company, as does Nadia. And in France and other parts of Europe, it's forbidden to gather race or ethnicity data. right? Race was removed from the constitution in France in 2018. And this was in response. So you have to understand the history. It was in response to persecution of Jewish people. And in an effort to rebuild after World War II, France redefined itself as indivisible, which means that you cannot identify people by their community affiliation, but rather by what they call objective criteria, like migration or citizenship. So you can't use, the reason was that the state couldn't use identity data for state action. So that to me was the most challenging, most difficult aspect. But I think we have an opening now, as I said before, with the murder of George Floyd and the videos going viral and demonstrations all around the world, that common piece that I mentioned about race, it's opened up a space that was previously closed. And I think we can use any entry point now, refugees may be one, to really begin to disrupt and to start the conversation. So let me just stop there.
No, thanks, Rohini, and thanks for those examples. And I think, your point about when you have people in your organization who are part of, say, the majority, have an opportunity to interact with someone who's a minority, and that can be refugees, it can be very beneficial on empathy and understanding. And I think that was one of the benefits Barilla saw from working to integrate some refugees in the organization, because if you don't interact with people that are different, you're never going to understand that difference, and you're going to think that they might have the privilege that you have, or the easy way, the life that you have, and not understand their barriers. So I think that's a really great point. Let's move on to the next second principle in your book, which is about leaders change to lead change. I'll start now with Nadia. If you can share an example of how you get leaders on board that have really not, bought in to the concept despite outlining the business case. So they're not involved yet in DE&I, and maybe you can give some examples and tips, Nadia.
Okay, I would try, but it's an easy question for me, because we started exactly from that point where leaders were not so convinced, and therefore having senior leaders not so convinced of the benefit of DE&I, it's not good. I mean, they must be convinced. If they're not convinced, you're not going very far, because you keep on fighting against a barrier, and that's a fundamental. So absolutely important. And how do you get them in? On one side, as I said before, you have to choose the topics or the dimension that are closer to their heart. But on the other side, there is another important, at least it worked very well in this country, my country, incentives. Link MBOs to DE&I actions and results. It works very, very good. So unless your management and senior leaders are already convinced, a good way to start determining a good turn is really linking incentives to the actions that you want to promote. That will make a big difference, I would say. And I stop here, because obviously to prove results, business result through DE&I, you need time. So you need to gain that time. And in order to have that time to build the experiences and the facts, you need to push. And this is MBOs is an extremely good way to push an action from management. And then you take it from there.
So Nadia, I think your point is that the leadership commitment is fundamental, and you've got to try different levers to, there's some buzzing noise, sound like a big fly or something. There's some, it's still a little bit of buzzing. Anyway, to different levers to get leadership commitment, and also you used in Sodexo bonuses, salary, money as one lever of incentivizing involvement in DE&I. Great, thank you, Nadia. I'll pass over to Mara. And Mara, if you could share any examples that you have from Konecranes, please.
Well, we have quite a long journey, I think, in this side. But I need to say, making a change management happening is a complex process. And typically you work in two dimensions. One is the more emotional part from the people. So how to create really the emotional buy-in. And then, of course, the processes are also important. So what we did was to identify a sponsor inside the organization and the leadership team who can advocate in some way, start to stand in front of the others, and the others can observe and watch. But what I think we did in a nice way, again, in particularly when COVID started, we created our kind of biographic portrait coffee and culture webinars. You were there quite a couple of times, Kristen. And we started to bring in our leaders, actually. And these webinars were fully related to diversity inclusion. And we invited them to say, okay, share your ideas and best practices. And you know, when they started to serve the first leaders going there was curiosity around, and even interest from the best practices from other colleagues, and start a bit this imitation process, or willing really to follow that. And that has been one aspect more in creating awareness. The other was to give really to the topic accountability and visibility. And we don't have actually bonus. We don't pay for the aspect of diversity inclusion. We don't have this level of target. But what we did actually, we have our Kone Cranes business system. It's a bit following the logic of the lean processes. And there we have our specific core drivers, and diversity is one of the core drivers, together with others like sustainability or like the financial ones and so on. And you know, this is very powerful, because when you need to report on a monthly basis what you are specifically doing in a very specific targets, and you feel that you have a green, you are proud of that, but when you have a red, you are forced in some way to justify why and what you will do in particular in terms of improvement, because it's a concept also of a continuous improvement. And there I think we started really to move in a faster pace by having this awareness aspect, but even to be accountable. Okay, today I'm ready this month, what I can do to improve, what I can do to do better. I needed to think about the actions with my team and so on, and have these active discussions. So those two elements has been strong enablers, I think, for us.
Thank you, Mara. I mean, I think that, you know, the two elements that you talk about, which is, you know, visible, verbal leadership commitment. So not just a leader saying, yes, I support DE&I, but actually standing up and speaking about it, even if they're not completely comfortable at first, is really important, because it does show a role model. It shows it's important. And then, of course, it's like any other business project. DE&I is a business project. You need KPIs, metrics, and accountability of those metrics. So I think you highlight two very good elements that the audience might be interested in, and to move the journey forward on diversity and inclusion. Rohini, on this same Leaders Change to Lead Change, can you share any strategy that you have in your book on this, in this principle?
Yeah. Sure. I think Mara and Nadia again really sort of nailed some of the things, because, you know, you're right that personal behavior demonstrates conviction, and taking action really signals a commitment, and you've got to be intentional and prioritize it as you would any other business imperative. So in the book, I have a bunch of different strategies, Kristen, which I call head and heart strategies. So the head strategies are more, you know, the incentives. The other piece that worked very well at Sodexo, remember, Nadia, was also the client connection. So making sure that you could demonstrate the business benefits. So these are the kinds of things that work. Well, let me share with you two very quick stories about the heart connection, the heart piece, right? Because ultimately, it is the emotions that impact people deeply and that make them change in a lasting way. So the two examples I have, one is actually of a CEO who in Europe who basically, you know, he didn't believe in the business case. He didn't believe in the importance of DEI, but I know that he wanted to network with other CEOs. So I got him involved in a cross-company mentoring program. And he mentored a woman from a different organization. This woman he developed a trusting relationship with. She got laid off. She shared with him stories about being the only woman, the discrimination, how she felt being in that C-suite, and then was ultimately laid off. And he came to me and he said to me after that, you know, mentoring relationship with her, he said, look, He said, I cannot believe that women have these kinds of experiences in the organization. This is unacceptable. Something he would not have internalized if he had not had this experience. So he said that I want every one of my 12 direct reports in Europe to mentor a woman from a different part of the organization. Now, of those 12 women, 9 of them or 10 of them actually went on to take on very significant portfolios, head up countries, CEOs of countries, etc. So, and it was very transformative for those leaders because they got to experience real talent, but also what it meant to be a woman lower in the organization, and they sponsored them. So I think that piece around storytelling is very important. The other one, which is very, very sort of disruptive for the CEO, this is a former CEO who we were talking about, gender globally, because that's a dimension you can measure. We hit targets, and that was our focus. And I talked to him about race and ethnicity, and he sort of said to me, he said, why are you sort of diluting the focus on gender when you talk about race, ethnicity? It doesn't translate in other parts of the world. And he was right. As I mentioned before, in France, for instance, you cannot gather data. Race was struck from the Constitution in France in 2018. But I realized that I had to expand his worldview and disrupt it a bit. So I invited him to the African American ERG in the US, and he attended the meeting. He was one of the only French men in that room, one of the few white men in the room. And he listened to the stories of African American men, their lived experiences, and the combination of being one of the only real minority in that room based on nationality and based on race, ethnicity, and listening to the stories was very disruptive for him. And he came away from that and really sent out a very heartfelt message in response to the murder of George Floyd, which he may not have done before, and internalize the importance. So I think in terms of bringing leaders along, you have to figure out, first of all, everyone has sort of this ecosystem of beliefs, and you have to understand what a person's ecosystem of beliefs is. You have to then use the right strategy, whether it's a head strategy around this is good for the business, or it's incentives, or it's be a role model, or I want you to get visibility talking about this topic publicly, whatever it is. And once they speak publicly, they have to deliver internally, right? You can't just speak and not deliver. Or it's the heart pieces that, I want to give them an experience of what it feels like so that they can then empathize. So there are many, many ways of doing it, and I'll just stop there.
No, thanks, Rooney. It's a combination. You said it's head and heart. And I really love this quote from Maya Angelou. I think many people know Maya Angelou, the writer and poet. She said, people will forget what you said, they'll forget what you did, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And that's the heart piece. Because, if you think about memories, our memories are very strong in the positive feelings and the things that, that are negative. Good. I want to encourage people to write any questions in the chat. We have one from Samantha, and we will get to your question. Don't worry. We're just going to cover 2 more principles, and then we'll open up to any questions that you'd like to ask the panelists. So let's go to the 4th principle, which is go deep, wide, and inside out. So let's start, Mara. Can you talk about any examples of this principle in your organization and share with the audience, please?
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. And I need to say, while we have embedded diversity inclusion in most of our people processes, I think that one of the powerful experience actually has been related to the language aspect. And I like to mention this one because it's one actually of the areas where I wanted to intervene and make a bit of emotions there, but also some change with the language aspect. I think that Rohini mentioned on an earlier stage how much we need to go to the countries where actually they are ready to embrace in some way diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that the cultural soul that the people bring with them make a difference. And that is what I realized quite immediately when speaking about diversity, inclusion, and using a global approach, that I can generate different emotions sometimes, even with the language to people, because resonating in different way based on your history. And that for me has been quite shocking in certain situation where I even didn't realize that we could have touch organizations. So one of the aspects, one of the projects that we have been launching in a more consistent way at the end of last year was the language project. And actually we started to work on our content and reviewing this one using actually an artificial intelligence tool that is helping us really to debias the language that we are using from multiple perspectives. It's not just a gender topic, could be age related, could be generational related, could be ethnicity related. So it's helping us to debias the language that we use, and together with this one also to start to use completely different visuals for the people, because at the end of the story, how you speak your story and your narrative is making the difference also within the organization, inside and outside, and make yourself much more credible or not. And we experience the power of that in particular when I try to attract talents to our organizations, because this has been really one of the elements that has removed certain barriers that we even didn't understand that we were creating. So that is one of the examples that I wanted to bring, because of course we had a lot of processes, but sometimes we don't really think how much can be depth and eradicate in our way of doing and speaking a certain level of barriers, of stereotypes or biases that we use on a daily basis.
No, thank you, Mara. I mean, I think that your points about debiasing the language, I mean, a lot of times job descriptions, we don't realize that the words that we use can be very masculine or feminine, and then you wonder why you don't have a certain person, applying for jobs. So I think that's really a great tip, is you have to have even external expert, or you use AI to try to look through, policies, job descriptions in any way. I think that's a great example you shared. Nadia, do you have an example to share? Pass over to you.
Yes, thank you, Kirsten. First of all, we have plenty of examples, and they're all very exciting. But first, I want to say something about this fourth principle from Rohini, because I think it's really well chosen in the words she chose, that it's it signify a lot in terms of embedding this culture within the organization, because she's absolutely right. An organization is a system, and the system is made of processes, tools, a number of elements that make it work. And if you want to instill a change of culture, you have to touch every process, every tool, everything. So as Mara said, the language is fundamental, absolutely right. And this is why, for example, we actually delivered a training module to start with to any single manager joining the organization, which was Spirit of Inclusion, where we really tried to use the same language to instill the same culture right from the beginning. So you really need to touch every single element to be successful within the organization. Recruitment, again, language, discrimination, a number of people for each position. There is no way I'm going to have just men for a position, because we don't know why. If there are women with the right skills, there should be as many women as many men, as candidates for that position. And then, as Rohini mentioned before, it's important in order to build results, because don't forget the beginning, we need to build the outputs and the results that DE&I can bring to business. So when you have built cases and you have built actions and results, you can sell them outside with our clients. So that's very, very important, build the know-how from within to sell it and to show what we are actually doing to the clients. How many presentations to our clients? How many times I was invited in Italy by our clients to share what we did? And how many times I've heard actually you are doing things. You're not just saying you are into D&I. So that makes me proud of what we have been doing. And again, thanks from the leader that started the whole work, Ruini.
Thanks, Nadia. That's a great example of how D&I can drive business. You know, it's part of business. It's not a separate entity. That's something that's nice to do. Mara, I want to pass really quickly to you. If you can look in the chat, there's a question from a few who want to know what is the name of the language AI tool that you where you have alluded to in your example. If you can write in anything about the tool that you use.
To write it down.
Yeah, right. If you just answer the chat would be good. Since we have about 15 minutes to go, Rohini, if you have any quick example to share of embedding DEI in the talent process from your book.
Yeah, so Kristen, I think first of all, I just want to acknowledge Nadia for summarizing that particular principle very well. And to Mara for the example she shared on the AI tool, because eliminating bias from the processes in the entire talent life cycle. So recruiting, retaining, engaging, promoting, all aspects. But beyond that, into marketing, advertising, supply chain is absolutely critical. So looking at all your processes with a DI lens. Let me just shift a little bit, Kristen, and share a quick example of localizing, right? So I think Mara started off with sharing an example about China. When we talk about engagement and we talk about incentives for people, let me give you an example of how you can embed DEI within the talent lifecycle, but be mindful of localizing. So the example that I share in the book is about a hot pot chain in China, where what they do is, as an incentive, because that with the younger population in China in particular, there's a lot of job hopping. People kind of move from job to job. There are many, many opportunities that they have. In order to keep this workforce, this particular hot pot chain, they give an incentives, bonus or an engagement incentive to their employees, but that incentive is sent to the family, to the parents. And the hope is that the parents will say, this is a good company. You should stay with this company, and discourage them from leaving and from moving. So it becomes a great engagement and retention vehicle. Now, viewed through a Western lens, this would seem completely unacceptable. You have an adult child and this is their money. They can make a decision about how to spend it. But, so I think we have to be very careful about how we approach these things. This is certainly a very good initiative and works very well within the context in China. So I'm going to mention that it's important to embed in your processes, but make sure you localize it as well. So let me just stop there.
Great, Rohini. Thank you for that example. And yes, you're right. We have a very big theme here as we're talking about localizing lots of the elements that come with your principles. Before we go on to the last principle, we have quite a few questions. I want to make sure that the audience has an opportunity to ask their questions, and I'm going to ask for them. So please write other questions in the chat. But let's go to the very beginning. The first question that came from Samantha. She was asking, a white Italian woman says to a white French woman, you and I are diverse. Not everything is about skin color. We have different backgrounds, different nationalities. I have a baby. You don't. I'm older. You moved to my country. We have different experiences. Why is this diversity not as important? So the question is maybe the comment was, well, the diversity of gender is the most important thing. Why are all these other elements not just as important?
Who do you want to answer that, Kristen?
Why don't you go, Rohini, on this question, then I'll ask.
Yeah. So I guess, my response is, if I understand the question correctly, I think we're all intersectional beings, right? So yes, these two are women, but they do have different experiences. I'm a woman, right? Kristen, Nadia, Mara are all women, but we each have different experiences based on our intersectional identities. I'm an immigrant from Asia. I live in the United States. I'm a mother. I'm a straight woman. I'm heterosexual. So all these are experiences that inform who we are. I would not say that one experience trumps the other. As I mentioned before, I think identity is very contextual. It depends on where you are. And that particular identity emerges. So when I'm in the United States, my identity as an Asian immigrant is very dominant. When I go to India, that's not as dominant an identity. It's a different aspect of my identity that becomes more dominant. So when I'm in a group of all women, perhaps I take that gender identity for granted and some other aspects emerge. So it depends, it's very contextual. And I don't think there's a hierarchy of these. I think we have to basically look at what our shared experiences are and then see what that, dominant experience is depending on the context. I hope that answers the question, Kristen, but, I think you look at it as an intersectional.
We're not saying that one element of diversity is more important than another. And many times I know we talk about gender diversity because we don't have so many women in different levels of the organization, but you may have an organization that's all, I'm American, so all American, white American women, then you need a different element of diversity, because the whole part about diversity is if you don't have a diverse team and you don't include that diversity, then you're really getting into a homogeneous group think. So hope that answered the question. We have others coming in. Thank you, Mara. You already answered the question from Samantha on the AI tool, but I'll now pass Nadia and both Nadia, but let's start with Nadia and then Mara. From Renata, she said, how to decide the diversity dimensions we will push globally and the dimensions we will only work on locally? She agrees that we have to make DI local, but how do you have some dimensions that are part of the corporate strategy and some that are local strategy? Nadia, first, if you have any thoughts on this.
Thank you, Kristen. If I have understood correctly the question, then I go back to what I said in the beginning in saying, yes, within the dimension that we define globally, because what happened was that at a certain point, Rohini launched these 5 dimensions, and we were supposed to find actions that we could implement within these 5 dimensions. So what happened, how do we pass from global to local? By choosing the dimension that we thought would work better in terms of potential action that we could implement immediately to be successful locally, but within the global strategy. Have I understood correctly the question?
Yeah, so if you have 5, whatever you mentioned, your 5 dimensions, then also,
exactly.
If you're going to focus on 2 dimensions, did you allow different countries to pick different dimensions, and some were dimensions of the corporate strategy? And that's, I think, what the question is. Some you picked on a corporate level, and some you allowed the local DE&I teams or the local organizations decide to focus on as well?
Yes, I think Rohini can correct me. I think we were absolutely free to choose among the 5 dimensions. Of course, if the culture were ready for all of the 5 dimensions, great. Probably I can mention some countries where everything was ready for the 5 dimensions, but in Italy that was not the case. So I had to choose and go first with the dimension. Now we are into 4 dimensions. We started with 2, now we are into 4. I have not won as yet on the 5th dimension, but what we
have to do it in a stepwise approach, and you can't do
step by step, because there is no point to create a crash with the senior management, with the senior leaders, if they're not ready for all of the 5 dimensions. So I have to make sure that I am successful, or at least I can influence through the action in some dimension, using also the specific actions within those dimensions. Because if I lose credibility on what I'm doing, I'm losing the power to go further.
Understand.
So I have to assess very carefully what works within not just Italy, but within our Sodexo culture in this country.
Exactly.
And so, Kristen, just to add to that, Nadia is absolutely right. She entered the different pieces, but the one that we had global targets on, that was a global piece, was around gender. And Nadia got to that maybe in a phased way, but that was the one that was a global requirement.
Yeah, and I think that to add the last piece, you can define diversity in the many elements of diversity, the many dimensions, which I know what the team did in Barilla, but then you have to pick how to start, because you can't do everything, and some cultures are not ready for all of those elements. So that's where they make it local comes in.
Exactly. Within the global, you make it.
Mara, do you have anything
to?
No, thank you, Nadia. And Rohini. Mara, do you have anything to add on that, or should we go to the next question?
Well, I can, in a very short, say that globally we define the general ground and what we expect in terms of common culture and values. But then how we deploy, it depends from really the local culture, and is with them and together with them that we needed to work. So at the end, being a diverse and inclusive culture means to value the uniqueness of the people, but this uniqueness can be different and feel different in the different countries. That is what we do.
Yeah, great. No, thank you. Thank you for adding that on. Mara. This is a tricky question. I'm going to ask Rohini. It's from Rosario. She said, how to advance EDI in toxic cultures? And I think she's probably talking about company cultures, I'm guessing, but yeah, in a toxic culture, what would you suggest as steps?
Right. So I think the, if I think back, who was the question from? Rosario?
Yes, from Rosario.
So when I think back at Sodexo, Rosario, it can be done. When I joined Sodexo, there was a class action lawsuit filed by African Americans. It was a promotion discrimination lawsuit, a very, very toxic culture in the United States. That's what I stepped into. Fast forward to today, Sodexo is known as a leader in this space. So it can be done, but I think what you have to do is to take this principles approach. You've got to really make sure that it's not seen as an initiative, a check the box. So where I would start with, I would look at the information and the data, unpack the data, see what your pressure points or your pain points are, align initiatives to those pain points. Is it about recruiting? Is it about moving people up in the organization? Is it about harassment and discrimination, which means a whole different set of initiatives that you need to take? While doing that, I would bring leaders along, explain to the leaders, or communicate out to the organization, what is the business benefit of doing this? Is it about retention of talent? Is it about engagement of talent? Is it about productivity? Is it about your customer base? Is it about your client base? Explain, figure out what that business benefit is to the organization. So that's the second thing. The third thing I would do is to bring leaders along. Once you've understood what your pain points are, what your issues are, what initiatives you need, you have data to back it. Second, what did I say? Bring leaders along, explain the business benefit, and then you bring leaders along in terms of moving their hearts and minds. So that's sort of how I would sequence it. I think, it can be done, even if a culture is toxic. We did it at Sodexo. You've got to have allies and champions that support you, but that comes over time, that you've got to have people, sort of supporting your efforts.
And even in a toxic culture, Rohini, you can find allies and champions who will want to work on this. You have to find those, right? Now, we only have a few minutes left, and we're not going to have time to go to the last principle, which is know what matters and count it. But then I highlight again the book. If you buy the book, you can read all of the examples and read more about that principle. But before we close, I'd like to go through really quickly what I call the lightning round, is go one last time around the virtual room and it's say just a few words. What's your last piece of advice for the audience that's on the line now? So Mara, I turn to you. If you give a quick last advice that we haven't covered so far today.
Well, be systematic in what you are doing. That is a business topic to implement diversity, equity, inclusion, and like each other business topic should be taken in a very systematic way to be advanced.
Thank you, Mara. Over to Nadia.
Yes, well, obviously I'm fully in agreement with Mara, but I say I would add for sure, be pragmatic. Just propose and take action that have impact on the results. This is a great proof of what you can achieve. And bear in mind that changing to induce an inclusive culture, you have to be patient. It's a path for any organization. It takes time, patience, but a lot of passion. You have to put everything you have into it to succeed, because if you are not determined enough, everything will be more difficult.
As you say, Nadia, it's a path and a journey. It's like it's all about progression, not perfection. So Rohini, last words before we close?
Sure. Yes, Mara, systematic. Yes, Nadia, passion and patience. And I would say that transformation happens at the intersection of the personal and the systemic. And you have to work on both. It's work that's ongoing. It has to be a personal and a professional journey for each of us. So keep doing the excellent work that you're doing. And thank you, Kristen, for your absolutely wonderful facilitation. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Rohini, Mara, and Nadia. It was a pleasure. Again, I put the book up here, and thank you for Diversity for sponsoring this event. I know Diversity has many events that are going to be very interesting for the audience. So look and get on their LinkedIn so that you can check out future events. And thank you again for inviting me and joining us today.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye, Rohini.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Nadia. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.